The alcohol seemed to hit him with a delayed, cumulative, pent-up force. A wave of gravy, a lifetime of gravy hit him and literally knocked him off of his feet. Or was it his own incipient Crutchfeld Jacob disease, the symptoms of which he'd never acknowledged out of fear of alarming his daughter? Or the magnifying effect of both his intoxication and the CJD that caused the old watchmaker to spin and fall as he did? He struggled to stand, to walk. But his direct line from point A to point B, from men's room to table, shattered into a delirium of vectors. He staggered, caroming into every surface he encountered. Now a human pong ball, erratically traversing the bar back and forth in a welter of veering zigzags, cross-hatching the bar's space, repeatedly collapsing in vertiginous pirouettes, groveling along the floor on all fours, somehow clambering again to his feet, lurching along another haphazard oblique trajectory, gesticulating like an airline attendant in an effort to navigate himself, teetering in circles, grasping for imaginary overhead handrails like a brachiating chimp, until he impacted another table or another wall, and whirled uncontrollably to the ground in a heap like those forsaken hobbling marionettes trying to escape the storm. He cycled through a series of ritualistic masks. A truculent scowl became a look of contemptuous hauteur, and then a coy pout, and then a look of cringing chagrin. The imperturbable serenity of a beatified saint suddenly giving way to PTSD, shell shock, and then the panic of someone about to be immolated by a mob. He looked up from the floor, like a hard-shelled insect on its back, helpless, simpering with mortification. It was a long, pitiable, shambolic dance of death, a danse macabre, some improbable version of Tatsumi Hijikata's Buto, his dance of total darkness. Of course, this looked like, from one perspective, nothing more than a drunk stumbling out of a men's room and trying desperately and without success to maintain his balance, to stay on his feet long enough to return to his seat. But from another perspective, there seemed to be a very deliberate choreography, where every action and every tilt of the head and positioning of a limb became meaningful. This was the phantasm of a body, the staging of a transubstantiation, a struggle with and rapturous capitulation to one's fate, the physical articulation of yet another allegory. His body, to borrow the words of the dance critic Jennifer Homans, quote, was pitched at swerving angles, arms, legs, hips, head oriented through multiple spatial planes. His eyes sent in one direction, jaw in the other, ribcage in one direction, hips in the other. Soon the feet turned out, the line took shape, the familiar positions emerged. His movements were wide, open through the chest, with deep epaulement, but they were also torqued and knotted, the limbs working in rhythmic counterpoint, end of quote. An intricate corporeal transformation from extreme old age to youth and back again. He danced a violent, strange flamenco. His body savagely capricious in its gestures. Exuding death outward in every direction, he mimed the act of tenderly sponge-bathing the Grim Reaper. A spasm-driven gesture of the arm that would begin by heading violently in exactly the opposite direction to the sponge, before tracing a wide arc of flight in space and then buckling in on itself to finally grasp the sponge, etc., etc. This is, by the way, a dance that is still performed by Chilesian fathers at the weddings of their daughters, and so finally, reeling, the watchmaker braced himself against a wooden post at the far end of the inn. He gathered himself, he squinted, trying to focus his eyes, and committed to a heedless line that diagonally bisected the entire inn. And he careened, his body canted at an impossible angle, toward the spot where he and his daughter had been sitting. And he somehow swerved backward toward that table and ended up propped upright in his chair, eyes shut, shoulders slumped, head lolling, his chin on his chest, breathing irregularly, drooling, motionless like this for some time. And then pitching forward slightly, listing slowly, until his forehead was flush against the tabletop. And here he began mumbling what was apparently some sort of demented nonsense to himself. Was this now the verbal apraxia of a stroke victim, or simply the unintelligible gibberish of a drunk with Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease? The patient pauses, letting the question hang in the air for a moment. Optometrist. The etiology is too overdetermined for a folktale to bear. Patient resumes reading from the Snellen chart as she peers through the lenses of the phoropter. But if you listen closely, you'd realize that it wasn't unintelligible gibberish at all. The watchmaker was murmuring those things, those most secret, intimate, and anguished things, those beseeching, prayerful things that one murmurs aloud to oneself when one feels most exposed and ashamed and abased, and when one feels paradoxically that some ennobling self-transfiguration may just possibly be within reach. And if you got very close and listened very carefully, you could begin to discern something organizing itself, a structure developing out of all this undifferentiated pathos. And you'd think to yourself, are we projecting all this, attributing an intentionality that isn't really there, or are we just hearing what we want to hear? After all, this is a drunk who literally can't pick his head up off the table at this point. But it's true. In what we'd so misapprehended as delirious gibberish, we now began to glean what seemed like deliberate pauses and cadences, like line breaks and caesuras and meters, stanzas and refrains. And again, we might wonder to ourselves if it's simply some kind of alcoholic auto-echolalia that's creating a mere semblance of verse. But that can't explain the uncanny formal ingenuity, the beauty of it, and then there emerged something of a cross between speech and song, a Schoenbergian Sprechstimme. A tipsy blacksmith with a long glistening beard had the chutzpah to blurt out. And then gradually an incipient but unmistakable melody. And again, was it simply an effect of the drunken lolling of his neck and the compression of his larynx? The slight spasms as he roused himself back into consciousness after momentarily fading off that gave a tonal rise and fall to his voice, creating the mere appearance of a melody. But again, no, there was a melody. There were verses and refrains. The watchmaker was singing, yes, a completely extemporaneous song that he was conjuring up as he went along, but a song nonetheless. And remarkably, the watchmaker's song was slowly taken up by the other men in the bar, first by one, then another, then several more, until they were all singing. Each and every one of them, they were singing the watchmaker's very words, as if they all knew this song, this hymn, as if somehow they'd always known it. And now they were almost like sailors, these grizzled ghosts at some shipmate's wake, singing a dirge about a rudderless, mastless ship disappearing into a dark mist or over some precipice. And amidst these men, their faces haggard, creviced with care, flushed with alcohol, singing, Bruegel faces, Hogarth faces, this motley choir singing, each of these old fathers, each the wobbling, moribund protagonist of his own disaggregated solar system, singing, the watchmaker died. And his body, as per his wishes, was unceremoniously flung into the Landwehr Canal in Berlin, the canal into which the revolutionary martyr Rosa Luxemburg was thrown after her execution by Freikorps thugs in 1919. And so this is the folk tale in its most unadulterated form that's read aloud from the spoken word karaoke screens by those in attendance at the bar Polpo on Father-Daughter Night. The numerous spoken word karaoke screens stream an array of variant versions of the folk tale which can differ wildly from one another. Some fairly radical alterations to the original have been attributed to algorithmic methods like predictive text and autocomplete. Which variant of father-daughter pair reads aloud depends on where they're sitting, i.e. on their sight lines to a particular screen. But although at any given moment any pair is likely to be reading something entirely different from any other pair, producing the bar Polpo's signature din of roaring babble, occasionally all the readers will coalesce into a short-lived synchronation, having randomly fallen upon a passage common to all the iterations, so that for a brief time everyone is declaiming the same lines in unison, reading exactly the same thing in perfect choral uniformity. But this concurrence will only hold for a moment or two, and then the voices wobble out of sync, reverting back to their default state of dissonant polyphony, punctuated every now and then by the sounds of depraved violence that surge in from the piazza whenever the front door is opened, like the looped soundtrack of an old video game. When observing the patrons who congregate at the Bar Polpo on any given Thursday night, some of whom are actual fathers and daughters, and some of whom are role-playing fathers and daughters, and whose ranks the authors of this volume have joined, it's exceedingly difficult to differentiate conversation from folktale, because their seemingly extemporaneous exchanges are frequently also verbatim recitations from the spoken word karaoke screens. We often have the eerie feeling as we traverse the text that the Chilesians themselves, among the most literate peoples on earth, are reading aloud along with us. Or, put another way, there's a mirroring reciprocity at play here. We're reading what the characters are reading, and the characters are reading what we are reading. Then there's this whole weird little interlude with the lozenge. Patient. Just as readers on both sides of the proscenium reflect one another, the divine hermit and the Chilesian mafia faction warlord, also consubstantial, surprise each other in the men's room mirror. Madness, criminality, devaquit, cleaving to the divine, and abstruse mathematics constitute the four pillars of the Kermunkachunkian Weltanschauung. Optometrist. I'm sorry, the what? Patient. The Kermunkachunkian Weltanschauung. She coughs, clears her throat. The optometrist reaches into a jar on his desk and fishes out a lozenge of some sort. Optometrist, would you like one? Patient, thank you. She unwraps the lozenge, puts it in her mouth, and resumes reading. Patient. Madness, criminality, devaquet, cleaving to the divine, and abstruse mathematics constitute the four pillars of the Kermunkachunkian Weltanschauung. Optometrist. Has anyone ever told you that you look like a young version of inaudible? It's an intriguing remark, given the fact that since she hasn't come out from behind the phoropter, we've never seen her face. Patient. Shrugs, sucking on the lozenge. I get Vanessa Hudgens now and then. Optometrist tilts his head, scrutinizes her for a moment. Yeah, I can see that. All right. He checks the lenses on the phoropter. Why don't we just pick up where he left off? Patient. Madness, criminality, devaquet, cleaving to the divine, and abstruse mathematics constitute the four pillars of the Kermunkachunkian Weltanschauung. The optometrist's cell phone buzzes on the desk. He checks the caller ID. Optometrist. I'm sorry, I have to take this. He turns away from the patient and speaks in furtive Yiddish, cupping his free hand over his mouth to muffle the sound even further. The conversation takes about a minute and a half, after which he places the phone back down on the desk. Patient. She says this as she peers through the phoropter, so it appears as if she's still reading from the Snellen chart projected on the opposite wall. A gentle, dignified man in his mid-60s with a good-natured, ready smile, crow's feet accentuating the glint in his eyes. The optometrist has lived a harrowing life. Both his parents were killed in a horrific home invasion. They were the invaders, not the occupants. Only 5 years old at the time, he was sent to live with a group of optometrists in Death Valley. He returned to the East Coast as a young, idealistic practitioner after losing everything during the Night of the Broken Glasses when neo-Nazis targeted Jewish optometrists, smashing all their lenses and frames. He refused to allow rancor to detract from the conscientious care of his patients, many of whom themselves were neo-Nazis. He methodically rebuilt his practice and in 2023 was voted New Jersey's most optimistic optometrist. In his spare time, evenings and weekends, he's involved with a group of optometrists from all over the country who are working to provide MS-13 with nuclear weapons. Though not without some basis in fact, this is probably just an astigmatic misreading of the chart, an instance of what optometrists call, quote, Ouija board effect, an unconscious permutation of the letters, or most likely just the lozenge talking. They forgot to put an end to quotes there. Optometrist, as in a reality show confessional in which a cast member talks directly to the camera. When we're not whispers with a wink. Smuggling centrifuge components. We like to say, he points to the Snellen chart. N'est-ce pas beau comme la littérature? Isn't it lovely as literature? When the optometrist says we, he means we, the descendants of Spinoza, the lens grinder. Optometrist returning to the patient. How's this? Any better? Sharper? By this point, only a melting sliver of lozenge remains in the patient's mouth. Patient. Sharper. Many of the divine hermits who were willing to sit down for interviews used the exact same words to describe their mothers: hard drinking, chain smoking, prone to writing wildly salacious emails, hitting reply all, and coyly feigning embarrassment. Oops! But Chalazians are unreconstructed animists, ascribing subjectivity and agency to almost all inanimate objects. They have sophisticated protocols that enable them to talk to and learn from their hair pomade, their cigarettes, their weapons, etc. These experiences are grounded in a cultural context that is markedly different from ours, so readers of Last Orgy of the Divine Hermit may initially be reluctant to view a wad of toilet paper, a wall-mounted soap dispenser, or an automatic hand dryer as a teacher or a guru. But this is a fundamental concept, if not the sine qua non, of their metaphysical system. And although the piazza is known as, quote, the bull ring of the non-discursive real, end of quote, the place where, quote, the real shit goes down, end of quote. The men's room at the Bar Polpo is also a, quote, bull ring of the non-discursive real, end of quote, and it is obviously the place where the real shit really does go down. The violence on the piazza seems indecipherable to the layperson, especially when viewed through the muck-encrusted windows of the Bar Polpo. But to the divine hermits, the savage interplay of the sub-factions has all the legibility and inexorable logic of the lettered tiles they shuffle so purposefully at the floating casino on Lake Little Lake. Once a young man or a young woman makes the decision to leave the Chalazian Children's Theater for the Chalazian Mafia faction and, quote, enter the piazza, end of quote, dousing themselves in the colognes that distinguish their sub-factions, their life expectancies shrink to a matter of several months. It is out on the piazza that they, quote, act out, end of quote. Here we behold another universe of discourse in which quasi-suicidal and indiscriminate carnage is seen as the articulation of a certain Anthropocene elan. Doomstruck, the hero rushes to his death as a young husband rushes to his bride on their wedding night. When a Chalazian woman says about a guy that he cleans up good, she means bathed in his own blood. In late medieval chivalric romances, Chalazian Mafia faction street soldiers were frequently portrayed as miniaturized, mechanomorphic vermin scurrying behind the toilets in the men's room of bars. In the winter, the temperatures plummet to absolute zero, and the piazza becomes a two-dimensional space like the reproduction of a Bruegel painting. And the tiny, almost subatomic CMF mechanomorphic vermin, like those lettered tiles, exist in a state of blurry flux, capable of occupying an infinite number of locations simultaneously. Optometrist. Beautiful. Now, how about this? Can you make out anything? Patient. That's a tiny font, bro. Optometrist. I know. Do the best you can. Patient. I'm guessing here. Faux discotheque, ceviche, funicular sugar tub. Time machine? The optometrist exchanges lenses in the phoropter. Optometrist. How's that? Can you make out anything now? Patient. Full disclosure, the author and his marvelous daughter, Gabby, visited me at my office at Texas State Tech College in Waco with the ostensible purpose of soliciting an introduction to their ethnography, Last Orgy of the Divine Hermit. This was not a complete surprise given the fact that I am one of the few academics who's actually been to Chalasia, although I focused my research exclusively on the Chalasian Children's Theater and deliberately did not extend my fieldwork to the Chalasian Mafia faction, having deemed that, and I admit this unabashedly, far too dangerous an undertaking. Kermunkachunk is the most insanely violent city on the face of the earth, so you really do have to salute the two of them for their courage. I say this somewhat grudgingly because the author, whose name I will not mention, is a vile human being, a disgusting, pathetic alcoholic. His daughter, Gabby, on the other hand, is just fantastic. A charming, poised, brilliant young woman. Very attractive. Gorgeous. Super hot, actually.